between me and you, I ain't never met the perfect girl. They either ain't that fun, they're way too young, or they ain't got a lick of sense. Well, I don't know if she exists, but I'm making up a list that I'm checking them all against. Yeah, she gotta be 5'11". She smells like heaven. She was born in 86 or maybe 87. She got full intentions of getting her PhD. She got a big old booty, a countrified booty. She's a certified, bona fide, cold-blooded cutie. If anybody knows where the perfect girl might be, won't you tell her about me? Tell her about me. Well, I don't mean to sound picky, but relationships are tricky, and I'm looking for a perfect fit. I want a smoking hot honey with a whole lot of money, whose favorite thing is sharing it. Well, you can't really miss her, hell, she may be your sister, but whoever she might be, you'd be a real lifesaver if you do me one favor and put in a good word for me. She's gotta be 5'11". She smells like heaven. She measures 36, 24 to 37. She got full intentions of financially supporting me. She got a big old booty, a countrified booty, and she don't get mad if I watch dirty movies. If anybody knows where the perfect girl might be, won't you tell her about me? You can tell her that I'm all alone and to call me if she would. You can tell her anything as long as it's all good. But she gotta be 5'11". She smells like heaven, lets me do what I want to 24/7. She got full intentions of letting me be me, and you know she got a big old booty, countrified booty, and she thinks cleaning house is a woman's duty. If anybody knows where the perfect girl might be, won't you tell her about me? Won't you tell her about me?
All right, we are live, and thanks for tuning in. It's been a long and boring day if you're talking about the impeachment inquiry and the various testimonies that have been happening. There were 2 testimonies today, and we're kind of going to run through some of the ones from both last week and this week. And I believe we're just going to go today through the ones that have happened and kind of where we are and how much of a waste of time this whole thing is. So there is this list here. Let me put it up on the display. These are the witnesses that are here on week 2. There's Alexander Vindman, he testified today. Jennifer Williams also today. Kurt Volker and Tim Morrison also today. Gordon Sondland should be tomorrow. Laura Cooper, I think, is also tomorrow. David Hale, Fiona Hill, and David Holmes. And then last week there was Bill Taylor, George Kent, and Marie Yovanovitch. So we're going to go through a few of these witness testimonies. And I think that if you're like me, you weren't really swayed either way in this hearing, except maybe to strengthen your own prejudicial idea about what's going on with this whole inquiry and where it's and really whether there's anything illegal going on. So let me start off by saying that going into this, I was especially prejudiced that Donald Trump probably did not commit an impeachable offense. But it's up to the observer's standpoint. You know, it's in the eye of the beholder what constitutes an impeachable offense when it comes to this president or any president for that matter, because there is simply such conjecture over whether impeachment should only be for legal statutes or whether it should be for other things that the president is responsible for. So, no, I think that largely if you came into the impeachment hearing thinking, well, I'm not going to change my vote. I'm not going to change the way that I'm thinking about this president, then it really didn't serve any purpose. So if you want a better channel to analyze some of the impeachment issues, I would recommend, and I'm going to type him in right now, this guy named Viva Fry, and he goes through, in fact, I might as well just I'll type in the video for his, let me see here. So this was from yesterday, his video about Jim Jordan's cross-examination of Marie Yovanovitch, who was the third person to testify. But we're going to go through 4 videos, and we're going to talk a little bit about how these affected the way that the impeachment inquiry is going. So this one is John Ratcliffe's examination of Bill Taylor from last week. So John Ratcliffe was supposed to be the director of national intelligence. His nomination was withdrawn this summer. And I can see now that it's entirely possible that John Ratcliffe's nomination was torpedoed by people who are now testifying in these hearings who didn't want someone who they didn't think was reliable in terms of steering national policy or national security policy. They didn't want someone like him in there who could disrupt their little club. But here we go.
From your testimony today that you both care a great deal about U.S.-Ukraine relations. It's also very clear that you're optimistic about President Zelensky. Ambassador Taylor, you related one of his first acts in office was to remove immunity from deputies, which had long been a source of corruption. I know you had a number of personal dealings with him. Has he given you any reason to question his honesty or his integrity?
No, sir.
In your prior deposition, I asked you, and I'll read it directly, if nobody in the Ukrainian government is aware of a military hold at the time of the Trump-Zelensky call, then as a matter of law and as a matter of fact, there can be no quid pro quo based on military aid. And to your knowledge, nobody in the Ukrainian government was aware of the hold. And your answer was that is correct. Is that still your testimony?
Mr. Ratcliffe, at some point in September.
I'm talking about on July 25th.
July 25th. Sorry. Yes, that's correct. That's correct. They did not know this.
All right. And as it turns out, President Zelensky agreed with you. On October 10th, President Zelensky held a press marathon with over 300 reporters where he said repeatedly and consistently over hours and hours that he was not aware of a military hold during the July 25th call. In fact, in his official press release from the Ukrainian government available on his website that I'll be introducing into the record, he said, "Our phone conversation bears no relations to arms. They blocked the provision of military assistance prior to our telephone conversation, but the issue had not been discussed during our conversation. I mean, I didn't even know." So now, in addition to confirming that because he had no knowledge of it, there was no quid pro quo involving military aid during that call, President Zelensky went on to confirm a number of things, that there was no pressure, that there were no conditions, that there were no threats on military aid. There were no conditions or pressure to investigate Burisma or the 2016 election, that there was no blackmail, that there was no corruption of any kind during the July 25th call. Again, from his official press release. Therefore, there was no blackmail because it was not the subject of our conversation with the President of the United States. There were no conditions on the investigation, either because of arms or the situation around Burisma Company. He told Reuters there was no blackmail. He told the LA Times there was no pressure or blackmail from the United States. He told Japan's Kyodo News, I was never pressured and there were no conditions being imposed. He told ABC News and the BBC, I'm against corruption. This is not corruption. It was just a call. The Ukrainian president stood in front of the world press and repeatedly, consistently, over and over again, interview after interview, said he had no knowledge of military aid being withheld, meaning no quid pro quo, no pressure, no demands, no threats, no blackmail, nothing corrupt. And unlike the first 45 minutes that we heard from the Democrats today, that's not secondhand information, it's not hearsay, it's not what someone overheard Ambassador Sondland say. That was his direct testimony. Ambassador Taylor, do you have any evidence to assert that President Zelensky was lying to the world press when he said those things? Yes or no?
Mr. Ratcliffe, if I can respond.
My time is short.
Your time
yes
is
or
short.
no?
That's right. I have no reason to doubt what the president said in his.
Okay, very good. So,
So you can see what John Ratcliffe did there, and that's really what we're dealing with. The American people are not necessarily hearing the unadulterated truth from anyone involved in this, whether it is the Democrats or the national security officials or the Republicans or even Trump himself, because everything's an issue of either perception or of what you can document. So if something can be perceived to be a certain way, yeah, you can show that to be an impeachable offense in the eyes of some people, even if it isn't technically a statutory crime. That's really what's going on. And I know it's frustrating for a lot of people who are on the conservative side, but yeah, technically if Donald Trump did not commit a crime, he could still be impeached. The issue is whether the impeachment rises to the level that the Senate would vote to remove him from office, and therefore he would then be indictable, and then they would have to find a statute that would be a crime against him. So I think for a lot of these things, I get it that most of us are not lawyers. I'm not a lawyer. I think that these are things that are not really taught in basic civics class that I think could be taught. I don't think it would take that long to explain to people exactly how it works, because the truth is we've had two presidents that are under impeachment in the past, 4 presidents, right? So 2 presidents that one has already been impeached, President Clinton. There were a lot of threats to impeach Bush. This president, Donald Trump, is also getting impeached. President Nixon was threatened with impeachment. The vote was almost cast. So those people saying, well, he can't be impeached for something that's not a crime. Certainly he can be impeached, but the question is whether people will decide that, or I guess the Senate will decide that this is a sufficient reason to remove a president from office, which I don't think it is. And what Ratcliffe actually shows here is that the president of Ukraine has denied in every public appearance and every public statement since this so-called event occurred, the withholding of of military aid. He's denied that anything untoward occurred, therefore meaning that for Ambassador Bill Taylor to sustain this line that what happened, drastically deterred Ukraine from defending itself against Russia, he would have to call President Zelensky a liar, and he's not willing to do it. And obviously he wanted to give a more nuanced answer, but Ratcliffe moved on from it.
this impeachment hearing today, where we impeach presidents for treason or bribery or other high crimes, where is the impeachable offense in that call? Are either of you here today to assert there was an impeachable offense in that call? Shout it out. Anyone?
Mr. Ratcliffe, if I can just respond, let me just reiterate that I'm not here.
I've got 1 minute left.
I know you only got a minute left. I've just got 30 seconds.
Please allow the witness. You asked the witness a question. The witness
I'll
will
withdraw the question. Let me just make this
And I'm not here to
point.
take
The
one side or the other. That's your
Ambassador,
decision.
let me answer this.
The
Let me ask you
the
this
gentleman will
question.
suspend.
Spend the time,
Ambassador
please.
Taylor, would
Suspend
you
the
like to
time,
answer the
please.
question?
Suspend the time, please. I withdrew the
The
question.
gentleman will suspend. We will suspend the clock.
Suspend the clock
Suspend the
at
clock.
1 minute, please.
Ambassador Taylor, would you like to respond to the question?
Mr. Ratcliffe, I would just like to say that I'm not here to do anything having to do with, to decide about impeachment. That is not what either of us are here to do. This is your job.
Will you restore,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
restore time to the clock to 1 minute?
No, but you may continue 22 seconds.
Fine. Mr. Ambassador, I think everyone knows that House Democrats have made up their mind to impeach one president. The question that we've just learned is whether or not they're prepared to impeach two. Because to be clear, if House Democrats impeach President Trump for a quid pro quo involving military aid, they have to call President Zelensky a liar. If they impeach him for abusing his power or pressuring or making threats or demands, they have to call President Zelensky a liar to do it. If they impeach President Trump for blackmail or extortion or making threats or demand, they have to call President Trump a liar to do it.
So I don't think that that was the smoothest line of questioning, but it shows what the real meaning of impeachment is. Impeachment is just impugning the credibility of either a witness or a person. So once you're impeached, that means that you've become discredited in a certain sense. It's effectively in terms of the legal statute that's going forward. If Donald Trump were to be impeached, that means he's indicted. He goes to a trial in the Senate. If he's acquitted in the trial, the impeachment doesn't even mean anything. The impeachment of a witness means that they are effectively disarmed and their witness testimony gets thrown into the trash. It's like basically any evidence that they had presented would be inadmissible, or it would be presented to the jury as something that's pretty flawed. So yeah, I mean, these are some very important testimonies to go through. We also have, this was a pretty funny one with Mike Quigley.
Hearsay evidence, and it's extraordinary.
Sorry.
So it's interesting and curious that we're talking about hearsay evidence, and it's extraordinary to me that the committee's been able to get as much information as they had, direct or hearsay, given the obstruction. You gentlemen were both asked by the State Department not to appear for your depositions. Is that correct?
We both received, I believe, I received initially a letter directing me not to appear, and once the committees issued a subpoena, I was under legal obligation to appear, and I am here today under subpoena.
Ambassador, were you also asked not to be part of the deposition?
Mr. Quigley, I was told by the State Department, don't appear under these circumstances. That was in the letter to me. And when I got the subpoena, exactly as Mr. Kent said, that was different circumstances and obeyed a legal subpoena. So that, yes, sir, I'm here for that reason.
Absolutely. But we were not able to hear testimony by Chief of Staff Mulvaney, John Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, John Bolton, more than a dozen witnesses. So I suspect if you have a problem with hearsay, you'd have a lot more direct testimony and direct evidence if you weren't blocking that ability. You'd have a lot more documents that you referred to with my colleagues' questions that have not yet been turned over by state or any other agency. Is that correct to your knowledge, gentlemen?
We're both here under subpoena. I don't think either of us is going to comment why others have not shown up.
But has any of the documents that you turned over, to your knowledge, been turned over to the committee?
No.
Mr. Kent, following the July 25th call and through the first 2 weeks of August, were you involved in any efforts to arrange for President Zelensky to make a statement announcing the two investigations that President Trump had talked about in the July 20th?
So let's rewind to near the beginning. He talks a lot about hearsay.
So it's interesting and curious that we're talking about hearsay evidence. It is extraordinary to me that the committee's been able to get as much information as they had, direct or hearsay, given the obstruction.
So I think they might have actually cut it off from this video. Here's one from PBS.
So that certification, that took place in May. Is that correct, Mr. Kent?
I do not believe it was certified by May. I would defer to my colleague Laura Cooper, who's testified on closed door. But
it was an earlier time.
It had not been done by May because when I was visiting in May, I was asked by Laura to raise a specific issue that would meet the conditionality.
But the DOD did say that they met the certification.
Yes, sir. I think it may have been in the July timeframe.
Thank you. So it's interesting and curious that we're talking about hearsay evidence. It is extraordinary to me that the committee's been able to get as much information as they had, direct or hearsay, given the obstruction. You gentlemen were both asked by the State Department not to appear for your depositions. Is that correct?
We both received,
So they're actually cutting off the part where he talks about hearsay evidence. It's pretty funny. I think we might actually have to go to the Viva Fry video.
Hearsay can be much better evidence than direct, as we have learned in painful instances, and it's certainly valid in this instance.
So this video, so this is a guy I'm talking about. He's a Canadian YouTuber, and you can actually watch this video. It's great. And so in the chat, I have Jason M. Am I going back over the testimony? I'm going to go through some of the more interesting parts of the testimony. So, this isn't going to be a full one. I don't expect, I know some of you, obviously Elron was in the Hard Bastard chat, so he was watching the full testimony today. And I have to admit, without that channel, I don't think I could sit through this garbage. It was so boring. And in fact, the New York Times had to write an opinion piece where they were addressing people complaining about how boring it was, because they're like, well, if this isn't something that is holding your interest, maybe you're the type of person who got Donald Trump elected because you want to be entertained. Are you not entertained? So, yeah, we're going to go through some of the more important parts. The vast majority of it was complete crap. Complete crap. And I'm not saying this, again, at the beginning of this, some of you weren't in the chat. I said that I came in, my prejudice, of course, is that I don't think anything that was illegal happened. Therefore, I don't think that a president should be impeached for something that's not illegal. Technically, you can impeach a president for things that are legal, but why would you? But here we go. We're going to go through fine law. Okay, none of us are lawyers, so we're going to go through some basic legal definitions. So the rule against hearsay is deceptively simple, but it is full of exceptions. At its core, the rule against using hearsay evidence is to prevent out-of-court secondhand statements from being used as evidence at trial given their potential unreliability. Hearsay is defined as an out-of-court statement made in court to prove the truth of the matter asserted. These out-of-court statements do not have to be spoken words, but they can also constitute documents or even body language. The rule against hearsay was designed to prevent gossip from being offered to convict someone. So, if someone had said in court that, I know that Joni is a prostitute because I heard that she sucked Brett's dick and that she later gave him $300, or he gave her $300, then yeah, that's hearsay. That's obviously this could have happened, but that's not really proof. Exceptions to the rule against hearsay evidence. Hearsay evidence is not admissible in court unless a statute or rule provides otherwise. Therefore, even if a statement is really hearsay, it may still be admissible if an exception applies. The Federal Rules of Evidence contains nearly 30 of these exceptions to provide hearsay evidence. Generally, state law follows the rules of evidence as provided in the Federal Rules of Evidence, but not in all cases. The states can and do vary as to the exceptions that they recognize. So let's talk about that. This would be at the federal level, so therefore some of those examples do apply, but this isn't really a court. So what we're really trying to say is that you want an exception granted in order to admit stuff that's not really usually admitted unless there is an explicit, lenience applied, just because you don't like this guy. And again, most of these witnesses who have already testified have agreed that nothing technically illegal happened. So there are 23 exceptions in the federal rules that allow for out-of-court statements to be admitted as evidence, even if the person made them is available to appear in court. However, only a handful of these are regularly used. The three most popularly used exceptions are present sense impression. A hearsay statement may be allowed if it describes or explains an event or condition and was made during the event or immediately after it. So that could be, let's say, the statement of a person after a car accident, right? Or during a car accident, something that somebody said. So you can't just recreate something that someone said in real time during an event. That can't be recreated. It has to be captured as something that was said at the time. And unless they were caught on video or something, it's not ready to be admitted. Excited utterance. Closely related to the present sense impression is the hearsay exception for an excited utterance. The requirements for this exception to apply is that there must have been a startling event and the declarant made the statement while under the excitement or stress of the event. So this is something that would be, let's say this person had been raped and, he or she had said something very unusual connected to that happening. Then existing mental, emotional, or physical condition. A statement that is not offered for the truth of the statement, but rather to show the state of mind, emotion, or physical condition can be an exception to the rule against hearsay evidence. For instance, testimony that there was a heated argument can be offered to show anger and not for what was said. So that kind of is a fuzzy one, because are they talking about what's being said in the argument or that the argument actually happened? It's really, so there's a lot of gray area there, and we're not talking about a jury trial. We're talking about a trial in front of, think about this, the judge and jury is the Senate Intelligence Committee, which, by the way, is only going to pass these hearings off to the Senate Judiciary Committee probably next month, where they're going to run through this again, by the way. So it's a huge mistake. I have no clue why people think that this was a great idea, even if you're a Democrat. And I'll explain again why that is in a minute. Other exceptions to rule against hearsay evidence. In addition to the three most common exceptions for hearsay, there are several other statements that generally will be accepted as admissible evidence. These fall into three categories. Medical, statements that are made to a medical provider for the purpose of diagnosis or treatment. Reputation, statements about the reputation of the person, their family, or land boundaries. Documents, these documents typically include business records and government records, but can include learned treatises, family records, and church records. So those things, I would say, are a little different from hearsay evidence, okay? It's a little different because those are professional assessments or character assessments. Hearsay exceptions if the declarant is unavailable to testify in court. There are exceptions to the rule against admissibility of hearsay evidence that apply only when the declarant is unavailable. A declarant is considered unavailable in situations such as when 1, the court recognizes that by the law the declarant is not required to testify, 2, the declarant refuses to testify, 3, the declarant does not remember, 4, the declarant is either dead or has a physical or mental illness that prevents testimony, or 5, the declarant is absent from the trial and has not been located. So that would be if somebody flew the country or something. If the declarant is deemed to be unavailable, then the following type of evidence can be ruled admissible in court. This includes 1, former testimony, 2, statements made under belief of imminent death. So that could be, there's like a priest there giving the last rites, and it's like, hold on, Father O'Leary. It was Ray Lewis, so something like that. Statements against a person's own interest, and 4, statements of personal or family history. So those types of things, I think, are I guess, the exceptions, and I don't think that they could be used standing on their own as evidence. Catch-all exception to the rule against hearsay. Finally, the last exception is the so-called catch-all rule. It provides that evidence of a hearsay statement not included in one of the other exceptions may nevertheless be admitted if it meets these following conditions. It has sound guarantees of trustworthiness. It is offered to help prove a material fact. It is so there are no material facts here. So let's be clear about that. It is more probative than other equivalent and reasonably obtainable evidence. Its admission would forward the cause of justice. The other parties have been notified that it will be offered into evidence. So it says here, though, if the court admits hearsay evidence under one of the exceptions, then the credibility of the person offering the statement may be attacked. This state attack must be supported by admissible evidence. So let's hold on a second. This attack must be supported by admissible evidence, but can be prior inconsistent statement, bias, or some other evidence that would show that the declarant has a reason to lie or not to remember accurately. Let's remember that the person who is being used as the avenue for the hearsay is a person who is a whistleblower whose name could not be said in the hearing because the chairman, Adam Schiff, said that that would violate whistleblower protection statutes. So therefore, you are trying to admit hearsay evidence that was conveyed to people like Bill Taylor. Bill Taylor is the guy over here that came to him via that conduit, via that person whose name I can't say, or else my channel will be nuked. And I'm also, by the way, my channel might not even be existing next month. I believe I've heard that a lot of YouTube channels are going to be nuked because of supposed non-commercial viability, which I guess, things like this were going to happen anyway. So remember, subscribe to me on BitChute. You can find me on BitChute. I'll put my BitChute channel in the chat, and we're going to move on to the next witness testimony, which was Jim Jordan questioning Marie Yovanovitch.
Thank you for your service to our country. Ambassador, should ambassadors ever try to influence host country elections?
No.
I think you said in your opening statement, partisanship of this type is not compatible with the role of a career foreign service officer. Is that right?
Yeah.
But that's exactly what happened in 2016. In August of 2016, the very month you went to Ukraine as our ambassador, the Ukrainian ambassador here in the United States, Ambassador Chali, wrote an op-ed in The Hill, said this: Trump's comments send wrong message. So the very month you're over there as our ambassador to Ukraine, Ambassador Chali writes that op-ed, and it wasn't just that attack, as Mr. Castor got into earlier, it wasn't just that attack on the president. We had former Ukrainian Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, who criticized candidate Trump. We had Mr. Avakov. I believe earlier you said, Ambassador, that Mr. Avakov was the individual who first alerted you to the efforts of Mr. Giuliani. Mr. Avakov, back during this same time period in the months just prior to the 2016 election, called then candidate Trump all kinds of names, called him a terrorist. And of course we have Mr. Lushenko, a member of parliament, who was a source for Fusion GPS and the now somewhat famous dossier that flowed from Fusion's work. He said this in the Financial Times, again, in August of 2016, when you first arrived in Ukraine. He said this: the majority of Ukrainian politicians are on Hillary Clinton's side. So you had several high-ranking officials in the government, in the Ukrainian government, and President Poroshenko is president of Ukraine, criticize President Trump, then candidate Trump, all in the late summer and fall of 2016. What I want to know, Ambassador, when this was all happening, did you go talk to anyone in the Ukrainian government about this? Did you go say to some of these officials, hey, you guys need to knock this off, this perception that we got, as Mr. Lushenko said, the majority of Ukrainian politicians on Hillary Clinton's side, that's not good. Did you have that conversation?
No.
Didn't talk to anyone in the government? Did you talk to President Poroshenko?
No.
Didn't alert anyone in the government?
No.
Well, one of the things we've heard so much over the last 6 weeks in depositions and frankly in the hearing on Wednesday is how important bipartisan support is for Ukraine. Democrats and Republicans agree they want to help Ukraine. In fact, the Democrats' first witness, their star witness on Wednesday, Mr. Taylor said Ukraine's most important strategic asset is this bipartisan support, and you would agree with that, right?
I do.
He said this in his testimony on Wednesday. On September 11th, I learned that the hold had been lifted the next day. Ambassador Taylor said, I conveyed this news to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian foreign minister, and I reminded Mr. Yarmak of the high strategic value of bipartisan support for Ukraine and the importance of not getting involved in other countries' elections. So what I'm wondering is, this is the day after the aid's been lifted, that Ambassador Taylor made this statement to the Ukrainian government. And he makes this after there's nothing been done by Ukraine to influence our election. Because President Zelensky didn't announce he was doing an investigation and the aid was lifted. But he felt he needed to say that. But in 2016, when we know that the majority of Ukrainian politicians want Clinton to win, because it was said by a member of parliament, when the ambassador to the United States from Ukraine writes an op-ed criticizing then candidate Trump, when Mr. Avakov calls candidate Trump all kinds of names, nobody goes and talks to him and tells him to knock it off. Did you have any conversations, Ambassador, with Victoria Nuland or Secretary of State Perry about what was going on in 2016 and this majority of Ukrainian politicians being for candidate Clinton and not and opposed to President Trump?
No, I did not.
No one did anything. No one did anything. You see why maybe the president was a little concerned about what went on in Ukraine? And you couple that with the corruption level that we know exists in Ukraine, you add to that this idea that he's not a big fan of foreign aid.
So we're talking about really what's a different rhetorical line of questioning. Now, I know some people are going to say, well, is he trying to get her to perjure herself? I don't know, but I think what he is trying to do is paint a picture of exactly why Yovanovitch is even there. Now, let's throw some context into Yovanovitch. She was fired a few months ago prior to the phone call that allegedly triggered this entire issue, wherein Donald Trump supposedly, demanded a quid pro quo from Ukraine in order to continue supplying foreign aid. And what he's really trying to convey here is that, well, now you're trying to testify here about a call that you weren't even in on, that you never heard, you've never even spoken to Donald Trump. And yet, all of this other crazy stuff happened in connection to Ukraine over the past few years, and you never raised any issue as the ambassador of the United States in Ukraine towards any of the people there that are involved in it. You didn't raise it with either Poroshenko or some of these other Ukrainian officials, Lyshenko, who are virulent anti-Trump people that believe that Trump is tied to Russia. So while she's supposedly saying, well, I'm a nonpartisan actor, I'm trying to help U.S. relations with Ukraine, when something happens that can create a rupture between two governments, typically the ambassador would be the person who goes in there and tries to smooth it over. She didn't take any such action, even though there were clear indications that members of the Ukrainian government were behaving in a certain way, that they were antagonistic to the U.S. Government, specifically to an office holder here in the U.S., Donald Trump. And she was basically saying, well, whenever all of that occurred, the Steele dossier, a lot of this other funny business concerning the 2016 election, well, I couldn't really see a reason to stand in. But now that Donald Trump is trying to investigate all of that, and he's trying to, I guess, go in and, directly confront the Ukrainian government and try to get some cooperation from them finally over this, well, now she has to step in. Now, finally, that Donald Trump is trying to address that issue, that's really why she's stepping in, because in reality, she's not there to serve the foreign policy interests of the United States in Ukraine. She's actually there to serve in order to preserve the relationship between American officials who are the permanent structure of government here and their Ukrainian counterparts, in order to save their hides, essentially. A lot of these people were members of the Obama administration. A lot of these people were people who either were put out or given, certainly inconvenienced by the defeat of Hillary Clinton in 2016. And suddenly when Ukraine's relationship with the United States has to be addressed in order to figure out exactly what went wrong in 2016, whether Ukrainian officials did have an involvement in that. Now she wants to get involved.
Why he might be a little concerned about sending the hard-earned tax dollars of the American people to Ukraine?
I'm sorry, is there a question there?
There was.
Okay, could you repeat it, please?
I'm asking.
Time of the gentleman's expired, but I'll allow you to repeat the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm asking, maybe we can kind of see why the president was a little concerned when you have the highest-ranking officials in the government, the ambassador criticizing him, parliamentary member Lashchenko criticizing him, when you have Avakov, the guy who first told you about Giuliani, criticizing him. All this going on, and when you couple that with the concerns he has about corruption, the concerns he has about Europe not doing enough, the concerns he has about reluctance to send in the hard-earned tax dollars to any country,
Jordan,
frankly.
I have indulged you with extra time, but
I appreciate
my
it.
indulgence is wearing out.
I appreciate it.
There is a question, right?
Our indulgence wore out with you a long time ago, Mr. Chairman.
Well,
I'll tell you that.
I'm about to gavel you down, so if you have a question, I suggest you.
I'm asking her, do you think there's maybe a reason that this was, that President Trump's concern was justified?
You know, I can't speak for the president on this, but what I would say is you've listed a number of actions. I think from my point of view, that doesn't create a Ukrainian government strategy to interfere in our election.
I didn't say that.
Mr. Jordan, please allow the ambassador to answer the question.
So I would just say that, you know, U.S. politicians will often criticize policies of foreign counterparts, even perhaps during their elections. You know, this happens in politics, and I think that it doesn't necessarily constitute interference.
Would you ever write an op-ed
Jordan, your time
critical of a
expired.
presidential candidate in Ukraine?
Jordan.
So that's really one of the more well-cited examples of testimony, because really it's showing that these people have a very weak attitude towards whether there's, you know, they like to claim that they're standing up for the regular order of the way that the State Department and U.S. foreign policy are conducted, but in principle, it's actually very weak, because whenever Donald Trump issues any sort of statement regarding anything that's occurring around the world, he, especially, remember with North Korea, people were jumping on him all the time for calling Kim the Rocket Man when he was talking about, I remember several times when he talked about Merkel, when he talked about other countries that are perceived as our allies, people were like, oh, he's shaking, he's rocking the boat, he's rocking the boat, he's so awful. This is really, it shows just how ridiculous it is, because these diplomats, they suddenly become lions when they see that their pet project, their ability to control the way our country conducts foreign policy is threatened. Now, I know that you're saying, hold on a second, she's just a diplomat. She's not really trying to control foreign policy. Well, in reality, I think a lot of these people are part of the same agenda, and I don't think that it's necessarily just a Democratic agenda. Today, near the end of the hearing, there was a question for, I think both of the witnesses, for what was his name, Tim Morrison, and for Ken Volker, or whatever his name was, Mike Volker, Keith Volker. Let me look him up. Kurt Volker. Yeah, I knew it was with a K. So they were asking him, hey, I mean, didn't you both really respect John McCain? Well, that's a nod. That's a tell, because, and they both said yes, because when you have two parties that essentially deal with this bipartisan consensus on certain foreign policies, then if there's a bipartisan consensus, someone who comes in and wants to change something is considered to be a threat. It's the same thing that happened yesterday, which is this is a policy. I'll just do this as an aside. I understand if people are opposed to it, But yesterday, there was an announcement by Mike Pompeo that the U.S. doesn't regard Israeli settlement activities building in the West Bank as illegal. And many people in the foreign policy establishment regarded this as a betrayal of 41 years of foreign policy since the Carter administration. President Carter had decided to issue a statement in 1978 that the Israeli settlements do constitute a breach of international law, and that this was a State Department opinion. Now Donald Trump has reversed that decision through Mike Pompeo, and a lot of people are up in arms. And you still have some people who are out there who say, well, this doesn't prove anything. It proves that Donald he's just trying to screw around with people. Well, no, it means that I guess he's decided that it's in his interests. It might not be in the United States' interest. I'll concede that. I don't know whether you agree with it or not. But he decided that it's in the U.S. interest to change the policy regarding the Israeli West Bank settlements. And therefore, a lot of people are pissed off because he's changed something. And that's really what's at issue here, that a lot of these people think, well, I've appointed this position. You can't tell me how we're going to change foreign policy. Well, this came up several times in today's hearing, but yes, the president, if he decides that something is not to his liking in terms of foreign policy, he can basically kick everyone else in the nuts.
Ambassador, I just want to clarify something before I yield. Are you against political appointed ambassadors? Is it not the president's prerogative to appoint whoever he wants in any country?
First of all, I am not against political ambassadors, just to be clear.
I just wanted to clear that up. Now, can I yield to Ms. Stefanik?
So this was after this was after Adam Schiff had silenced Elise Stefanik when she tried to enter into the record a number of statements that he made to the press. And this was an interesting strategy regarding the whole issue with the whistleblower. And again, this is showing that a lot of this is a huge waste of time, because you have here this woman, Marie Yovanovitch, who never, ever, ever spoke to Donald Trump in her time as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. But suddenly she's this big, important woman, whereas the person who supposedly was the main fountain of information, who is the whistleblower, whose name I can't even mention, he's not even supposed to appear before the committee.
Permission? You may yield.
Thank you. Ambassador, before I was interrupted, I wanted to thank you for your 30 years of public service, from Mogadishu to Ottawa to Moscow to London to Kyiv. I also wanted to thank you for hosting the numerous bipartisan delegations I led.
So you can see actually above one of the GOP members of Congress, it says, I think it even says 93 days since Adam Schiff learned the identity of the whistleblower, because he'd lied the previous week and said that he didn't know the identity of the whistleblower.
Kyiv. I also wanted to thank you for hosting the numerous bipartisan delegations. I led one of those delegations in Ukraine. My questions today will focus on three key themes. The first is the role of the president when it comes to appointing our ambassadors. The second is long-standing corruption in Ukraine. And the third is aid to Ukraine. Earlier this week, as you know, we heard from George Kent. And I know that Mr. Kent is a colleague, a friend, and someone who you deeply respect. In his testimony, he stated, all ambassadors serve the pleasure of the president. You would agree with that statement, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, he elaborated and went on to emphasize that this is without question. Everybody understands that. You would agree with that?
I would agree with that.
And in your own deposition under oath, you...
So by agreeing with that, she effectively says, well, everything I say is in the context of my job, so long as the president wants me to stay at the job.
Stated, quote, although I understand, everyone understands that I serve at the pleasure of the president. Is that correct?
Yes.
And just so there's no public confusion, you are still an employee of the State Department, correct?
Yes.
And in the deposition, you say that you personally asked whether it would be possible to be a fellow at Georgetown University, and that was arranged for me, and I'm very grateful. That's where you're posted today, correct?
Yes.
Georgetown students are lucky to have you. We are lucky to have you in Foreign Service, and I again want to thank you for your tremendous public service. Shifting gears to corruption in Ukraine, in your powerful deposition, you described, quote, "We have long understood that strong anti-corruption efforts must form an essential part of our policy in Ukraine, and now there is a window of opportunity to do that. And so why is this important, and why is this important to us? Put simply, anti-corruption efforts serve Ukraine's interests, but they also serve ours as well." Is that still your testimony?
Yes.
And particularly at the critical time in 2014, after the Ukrainian elections, you testified that the Ukrainian people had made clear in that very election that they were done with corruption, correct?
Yes.
And you also testified that the Ukrainians thought it would be a good idea to set up this architecture of a special investigative office that would be all about the crimes of corruption, correct?
Yes.
And I know this was before you arrived in Ukraine, but you are aware that the first case that the US, UK, and Ukraine investigators worked on was in fact against the owner of Burisma.
Yes.
And that was during the Obama administration.
Yes.
And in your testimony, you said today, the investigation was never formally closed because, quote, "It's frankly useful to keep that company hanging on a hook," right? That's your quote.
Yeah, the Ukrainian investigation was never closed.
Partnered with the US and the UK.
As I understand it. Yeah, although because we didn't see the Ukrainians moving forward on that, we no longer partner with them on that case or in that way.
But let's take a step back. The first.
So notice what that means. It means that at a certain point back in, I think, either 2012 or 2013, when the Poroshenko government took power in Ukraine, there was a decision to start to investigate the Burisma Holdings company in order to bring to light whether they had certain corrupt dealings over there. Then at a certain point, it was decided that it would not be in the interest of the Ukrainian government to bring that prosecution forward to trial. So therefore, they kind of left it in limbo, and Yovanovitch is saying, well, we decided we'd take our hands off a little at that time. Well, this is all consistent with the whole timeline of there being a prosecutor that was removed, and then Hunter Biden comes in. All of that starts to happen. This is purely an exhibit of how, first of all, how malleable U.S. policy was towards Ukraine at the time. Think about it. Obama's administration said, well, we'll help you get rid of corruption. And then when Ukrainians decided, you know, this whole going after corruption thing, it's a little too hard, they said, okay, I guess we won't, right? That's the most charitable reading of it, right? The harder reading would be that, well, the U.S. was allowing the Ukrainians to soft pedal this and eventually kind of shelve the investigation. Why? Because somebody very influential in the government, in our government, was involved in it. And that's really the problem here, that she never saw any issue with that. She was basically saying, you know, they're going to fight corruption, not fight corruption, whatever. It's okay with me. You know, anything that goes over there, it's fine with me. Suddenly Donald Trump comes in, it's literally Armageddon for her.
Time you personally became aware of Burisma was actually when you were being prepared by the Obama State Department for your Senate confirmation hearings. And this was in the form
that's
of
really the problem
questions
here,
and answers.
that she never.
This was your deposition. And you testified that in this particular practice Q&A with the Obama State Department, it wasn't just generally about Burisma and corruption, it was specifically about Hunter Biden and Burisma. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And the exact quote from your testimony, Ambassador, is, quote, "The way the question was phrased in this model Q&A was, what can you tell us about Hunter Biden's, being named to the board of Burisma?" So for the millions of Americans watching, President Obama's own State Department was so concerned about potential conflicts of interest from Hunter Biden's role at Burisma that they raised it themselves while prepping this wonderful ambassador nominee before her confirmation. And yet our Democratic colleagues and the chairman of this committee cry foul when we dare ask that same question that the Obama State Department was so concerned about. But we will continue asking it. And lastly, in my 20 seconds left, I just want to get it on record. In terms of defensive lethal aid, which you were an advocate for, that was not provided by President Obama. It was provided by President Trump.
That's correct.
I yield back 5 seconds.
So this shows that if you're a person who is so concerned about the U.S. relationship with Ukraine, that you think that it's essential that Ukraine receive American weaponry in order to fight the Russians, then it really is the Trump administration that stood up to provide some of it, along with, by the way, Congress really did push it. And it's not something I necessarily support because I don't think that we have to be involved in that. I think fundamentally, I think that we should probably just try to broker a truce between those two countries because I don't care what the fuck is going on between Ukraine and Russia. So the truth is that we have these witnesses that keep coming forward, and what they're really trying to do is protect an institution. They're not trying to protect the actual law. They're not trying to protect the citizens of the country. They're trying to protect their own institution, which is their themselves. They are the deep state. They're Washington insiders, things like that. So then a couple things that happened today. So I'm just going to play the Jim Jordan questioning of Alex Vindman, and I think after that I'll try to wrap up.
For your service and sacrifice to our great country. This afternoon, your former boss, Mr. Morrison, is going to be sitting right where you're sitting, and he's going to testify. And I want to give you a chance. I think we're bringing you a copy. I want to give you a chance to respond to some of the things Mr. Morrison said in his deposition, page 82 of the transcript from Mr. Morrison. Mr. Morrison said this: I had concerns about Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's judgment. Among the discussions I had with Dr. Hill in the transition was our team, its strength, its weaknesses, and Fiona and others had raised concerns about Alex's judgment. When Mr. Morris was asked by Mr. Castor, did anyone ever bring concerns to you that they believe Colonel Vindman may have leaked something? Mr. Morrison replied, yes. So your boss had concerns about your judgment. Your former boss, Dr. Hill, had concerns about your judgment. Your colleagues had concerns about your judgment, and your colleagues felt that there were times when you leaked information. Any idea why they have those impressions, Colonel Vindman?
Yes, Representative Jordan. I guess I'll start by reading Dr. Hill's own words, as she attested to in my last evaluation that was dated middle of July, right before she left. Alex is a top 1% military officer and the best Army officer I have worked with in my 15 years of government service. He is brilliant, unflappable, and exercises excellent judgment.
So
It was exemplary during numerous visits, so forth and so on, but I think you get the idea. Mr. Morrison, yeah, the date of that was, let's see, I'm sorry, July 13th. So, Mr. Jordan, I would say that I can't say what why Mr. Morrison questioned my judgment. We had only recently started working together. He wasn't there very long, and we were just trying to figure out our relationship. Maybe it was a different cultures, military culture versus.
And Colonel, you never leaked information?
I never did, never would. That is preposterous that I would do that.
Okay. Colonel, it's interesting. We deposed a lot of people in the bunker in the basement of the Capitol over the last several weeks, but of all those depositions, only 3 of the individuals we deposed were actually on the now somewhat famous July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. There was you, the individual sitting beside you, Ms. Williams, and then there, of course, was your boss, Mr. Morrison, who I just read from his deposition. When we asked Ms. Williams who she spoke.
So this is going to be the most important part of today's testimony, in my opinion. You see here, Jim Jordan effectively draws a very good rhetorical trap for what's going on.
Spoke to after the call about the call. She was willing to answer our questions, and chairmanship allowed her to answer our questions. When we asked Mr. Morrison who he spoke to after the call about the call, he was willing to answer our question, and Mr. Chairmanship allowed him to answer our question. But when we asked you, you first told us 3 individuals.
So if you see here, look at his lawyer.
He was willing to answer our question, and Chairman Schiff allowed him to.
So he does kind of a nervous movement of his face here, because he knows that Jim Jordan has sort of locked his missile in on their weak spot.
Answer our question. But when we ask you, you first told us 3 individuals at the NSC, your brother and the 2 lawyers. And then you said there was a group of other people you communicated with, but you would only give us 1 individual in that group, Secretary Kent. And the chairman would only allow you to give us that name. When we ask you who else you communicated with, you would not tell us. So I want to know first, how many other people are in that group of people you communicated with outside the 4 individuals I just named?
Yes, Mr. Jordan, on call readout, certainly after the first call,
So notice he's saying, well, you told this person your brother, you told these I think they were either State Department or National Security Council lawyers. And then you said you told us you told this group of people that you're not going to tell us their identities. Well, how many people are in that group of people? Because if we can't know either who they are or how many of them there are, how are we to know that they're not this reporter that you're leaking to? Doesn't that sound like a pretty good question?
there were probably a half a dozen or more people that I read out. Those are people with the proper clearance and the need to know. In this case, because of the sensitivity of the call, and Mr. Eisenberg told me not to speak to anybody else, I only read out, outside of the NSC, 2 individuals.
2 individuals.
Das Kent and one other person.
And you're not willing to tell us who that other individual is?
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
So Eric Swalwell, like he opens his big, he opens his big anus and lets out a big belch of air, of gas. And he kind of, he should have shut up, because what they're doing here is effectively showing that this guy is the guy who leaked to the whistleblower.
The gentleman will suspend. Counsel.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask you to enforce the rule with regard to the disclosure with regard to the intelligence office.
Thank you, counsel. As I indicated before, this committee will not be used to out the whistleblower. That same
Mr. Chairman,
necessity
can you
of
first
protecting
stop the time
whistleblower
so I don't lose the time?
will persist. You are recognized again, Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Chairman, I don't see how this is outing the whistleblower. The witness has testified in his deposition that he doesn't know who the whistleblower is. You have said, even though...
So he's got them right there. Think about it. Adam Schiff says he doesn't know who the whistleblower is, and neither does the witness. And yet the witness's lawyer is saying that we would like you to enforce the whistleblower protection when the witness is asked who he spoke to about the phone call. Right? So this is essentially got you. And I know a lot of people say, well, gotcha questions are bullshit, right? Asking gotcha questions are kind of, this is not real good faith arguments. And I know that on my debate back in September, people were really complaining, oh, you're asking gotcha questions. Well, when you're trying to impeach a witness, when you're trying to impeach an opponent, when you're cross-examining someone, gotcha questions are the way to get them. How else are you going to get someone unless you're going to gotcha question them?
No one believes you. You have said you don't know who the whistleblower is. So how is this outing the whistleblower to find out who this individual is?
Jordan, this is your time for questioning. You can use it any way you like, but your question should be addressed to the witness. And your question should not be addressed to trying to out the whistleblower.
Well, okay. Colonel Vindman, there's another...
See how pathetic that is? He's like, well, you should be trying to ask the witness something, but you shouldn't be trying to out the whistleblower, who I don't know who he is, and who the witness said that he doesn't know who he is.
Thing Mr. Morrison told us in his deposition. He said he was not concerned about the call itself. He said there was nothing illegal or improper on the call, but he was concerned about the call leaking, the contents of the call leaking. He said this. He was concerned how it would play out in Washington's polarized environment, how the contents would be used in Washington's political process. Mr. Morrison was right.
Excuse me, Mr. Jordan, could I get a page?
Page 44. Mr. Morrison was right. The call leaks, The whistleblower goes to Chairman Schiff, staff. Then he runs off to the lawyer, the same lawyer who said in January of 2017 the coup has started against President Trump. The one thing the Democrats they didn't count on was the president releasing the call transcript and letting us all see what he said. They didn't count on that. Transcript shows no linkage. The two individuals on the call have both said no pressure, no pushing, no linkage, but security assistance dollars to an investigation. Ms. Williams, after the call on the 25th, we know that Colonel Vindman talked to several people. After the call on the 25th, how many people did you talk to about the call?
I did not speak to anybody about the call.
Didn't speak to anybody.
No.
So that's it. That's the end of that video. But the substance of this cross-examination is that this person, if he testified earlier or he maintained under questioning, they didn't know who the whistleblower was, but it comes out that he did leak to the whistleblower, right? And his lawyer knows who the whistleblower is, then his credibility has been impeached, and therefore he is not a credible witness. And that's really the way that I think this impeachment hearing is going. So tomorrow you have the Gordon Sondland impeachment hearing, and today we did have, I saw most of it. I saw the hearing for Tim Morrison and Kurt Volker, and that hearing I did see that Morrison actually refuted this issue with Alex Vindman, because Vindman had claimed that he hadn't gone to Tim Morrison to talk about his concerns with the call until much later because he was too busy that week, but he'd gone to Morrison to talk about edits to the call summary and transcript, I believe, that same day. So a person who claims, I didn't have time to talk about my concerns, but it is revealed that he did have time to come and request edits, that's a person who I would say is not a credible person. And that's the way that this impeachment inquiry is going, and it's not really swaying anyone. I would say that first of all, nobody's seen anything in here that is really changing the definition of what is legal or illegal in terms of what Donald Trump did. Now they're trying to say, oh, Donald Trump tried to bribe the president of Ukraine. It doesn't work that way. I mean, how are you bribing him with money that's already been allocated for his country? It's really kind of ridiculous. So we'll see what happens tomorrow. Thanks for stopping by to watch this assessment of the impeachment inquiry up until now. And I don't know if I'm going to do another one tomorrow. Obviously, I think that, well, first of all, tomorrow I'm not even going to be available in the morning to watch it. So I'll probably have to catch up on it sometime. And therefore, we'll see what happens. I might try to catch some highlights. Then on Thursday, I think that there is the final impeachment inquiry hearing. And then, so to wrap it up, this is the end. These people have already testified at the closed door hearings, the ones that Schiff had without first of all, Republican ability to ask questions. So they've testified one time. Those transcripts can now be cross-checked with the statements that they're making now, and that's a problem for every witness. When you're putting a witness on the stand, you do have this issue where that becomes the record. Now, the more times you put them to testify, the more times the more opportunities they have to perjure themselves or to have their testimony shown to be unreliable. So they've already had it done 2 times. Apparently, so this is something that I saw from PBS earlier this week from an article that they had. They're going to have to move this to the Judiciary Committee, which actually deals with the impeachment itself, next month, and they're going to have to put these witnesses in front again, in front of the Judiciary Committee. Do you realize how? So there's going to be 3 opportunities for these people to perjure themselves and bloody their reputations, and by then it's not really going to be very easy for people to continue to pay attention to this, first of all, and second of all, for them to keep their stories straight. Because now, if there's this issue of Alex Vindman being the leaker, well, if it comes to light that that's what really happened, then do you think the Democrats are going to want him to testify next month? Suddenly, before the Judiciary Committee, we're going to have, I think, who's the Mark Meadows, I think, is the Republican ranking member on the committee. If he starts to say, well, Jerry Nadler, are you going to let this guy testify, Alex Vindman? Are you going to subpoena him? And now there's going to be like, well, I don't think that Vindman really is that important. Well, you've just removed a very important witness because he was very close to the event. He was actually closer to the event than the so-called whistleblower. Do you realize how ridiculous that is? So the more these people trip over themselves, the harder it is going to be to get the ball over the goal line. That's the way. Remember, in football, it's not about how many yards you gain, because in the end, if you can't execute in the red zone, it's meaningless. That's what's going on over here. And next month is going to be very, very interesting, given the events of today and the events of the past week. I think that personally, some of these witnesses will probably be thrown away because nobody really cares what they have to say, especially that Bill Taylor and George Kent. Everything that they said was hearsay. So it's all meaningless, and I can't believe that our attention is being grabbed by it. But hey, I had you guys watch it for, it says here, 71 minutes. So have a great day, and I'll talk to you later. Also, please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Subscribe to me on BitChute especially. Let me put my BitChute channel in the chat again, because otherwise, once this channel does get, nuked, because it probably will, I'm not going to be able to reach you guys anymore. I mean, who knows? How long am I going to keep doing this? It doesn't matter. But, yeah, especially on BitChute, on Minds.com. You can also find me on Subscribestar, all of those. My tag is Chef Leopard, so it looks exactly like this. And on Gab, it is Starscream 85. And I'll talk to you guys later.
Thinking about the women of this old world. Well, I've known quite a few, but between me and you, I ain't never met the perfect girl. They either ain't that fun, they're way too young, or they ain't got a lick of sense. Well, I don't know if she exists, but I'm making up a list that I'm checking them all against. Yeah, she gotta be 5'11", she smells like heaven. She was born in 86 or maybe 87. She got full intentions of getting her PhD. She got a big old booty, a countrified booty. She's a certified, bona fide, cold-blooded cutie. If anybody knows where the perfect girl might be, won't you tell her about me? Tell her about me. Well, I don't mean to sound picky, but relationships are tricky, and I'm looking for a perfect fit. I want a smoking hot honey with a whole lot of money, whose favorite thing is sharing it. Well, you can't really miss her, hell, she may be your sister, but whoever she might be, you'd be a real lifesaver if you do me one favor and put in a good word for me. She's gotta be 5'11", she smells like heaven. She measures 36, 24 to 37. She got full intentions of financially supporting me. She got a big old duty, a countrified booty, and she don't get mad if I won't you tell her about me? You can tell her that I'm all alone and to call me if she would. You can tell her anything as long as it's all good. But she gotta be 5'11". She smells like heaven, lets me do what I want to 24/7. She got full intentions of letting me be me. And you know she got a big old booty, countrified booty. And she thinks cleaning house is a woman's duty. If anybody knows where the perfect girl might be, won't you tell her about